The leaders of Australia, India, Japan and the United States convened for their first in-person quadrilateral security dialogue on Friday. Amid the global pandemic, economic downturn and geopolitical challenges arising in the Indo-Pacific region, the so-called Quad countries made it clear that they'll be taking the lead in the recovery for the region, from cooperating on COVID-19 vaccines to dealing with climate change and funding infrastructure development. While it wasn't expressed in so many words, the Quad will undoubtedly be competing with China, aiming to curb its growing influence and aggressive behaviour in the region. And their announcement was made after a landmark security alliance was forged by Australia, the UK and the US. We discussed these developments and the prospects for the region with Ian Hall, Professor of International Relations at Griffith University, and Jae-chun Kim, Professor of the Graduate School of International Studies at Sogang University. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us today. And it seems we have a lot of things to unpick. So starting with you, Professor Hall. Now, the Quad leaders over the weekend, they showed that they were serious about becoming the leading force for regional recovery, economic growth and security, with plans to cooperate on everything from vaccines, IT, infrastructure and climate change. But the question is, can they get other countries on board, given that China's already been bankrolling a lot of projects, from green infrastructure, just loans, COVID-19 distribution? What is it going to take for this collaboration to expand?
Well, that is the great challenge, isn't it, across the region, is how far is the Quad going to be able to persuade countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Pacific and so on to come on board with the initiatives that it offers. And there's no doubt as well that the Quad has been playing catch up a little to what China has been doing with the Belt and Road Initiative and other things across the region. And it's been slowed down too by COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021, particularly the outbreaks in India and in the US have slowed down things like vaccine distribution, which the Quad had promised earlier on in 2021.
Professor Kim, how do you see this? I mean, from cooperating on vaccines to IT and infrastructure, the Quad leaders' joint statement seemed to indicate that they're going to be in charge of setting the tone for regional geopolitics. But it's still it's not expressly a formal alliance nor an institution. How do you see this initiative playing out in the Indo-Pacific region?
That's right. Quad is not a formal alliance because there is no formal defense pact. Rather, it's more of a loosely organized strategic partnership or security dialogue, if you will. Sure, Quad countries conduct joint military exercises from time to time. This year, Quad countries held what is known as a Malabar joint military exercise. But this was the first time all four Quad countries participated in a joint military exercise. I think we'll have to remember that Quad started out as Tsunami Core Group back in, I think it was 2004, when four Quad countries got together for disaster relief when Southeast Asian countries were hit hard by tsunami. I think that spirit and tradition is still well alive because Quad still has its eyes on rather non-traditional security issues such as pandemic, climate change, and cybersecurity rather than hard military issues. True that the Quad in 2021 is more institutionalized than, say, the Quad in 2010s, but still, I think it's safe to say that the Quad is under-institutionalized, and that's exactly how the Quad is going to operate and then play out in the region. We all know that as you said, Soo-young, is targeting China. We all know that Quad is also concerned about traditional security issues, such as traditional territorial dispute in South China Sea. But by playing up the importance of non-traditional security issues, Quad can be more acceptable or amenable to countries in the Indo-Pacific region.
Right, and Professor Kim, the US has made it pretty clear that it won't go second place to China in terms of these non-traditional security issues. But when it comes to building its alliances or approaching other countries to stand with the US in terms of countering China, why doesn't Washington just join the CPTPP or make bigger commitments to existing multilateral institutions?
That, I think, is a very important question because the CPTPP, I believe, is strategically very important. When the Obama administration inaugurated what is known as Pivot to Asia or Asia Rebalancing Strategy, TPP was really the golden child of that strategy. It was the centerpiece of rebalancing strategy. But unfortunately, TPP, which is the predecessor of CPTPP, wasn't really popular among many Americans because they thought that the deal would take away their jobs. President Trump eventually walked out of the deal. Later, Japan revived TPP and reintroduced it in the form of, comprehensive and progressive TPP. To make a long story short, Soo-young, CPTPP is a very high standard mega free trade agreement, FTA among 11 countries. And if the Biden administration can somehow decide to join CPTPP, I think it'll work to their advantage tremendously. I mean, in the context of countering China's growing economic influence in the region, maybe more so than that AUKUS deal that three countries entered into. But this is not happening because CPTPP is still not a popular policy choice in the United States. Now China is saying that they want to join CPTPP, which is not going to happen because of high standards of CPTPP. But nonetheless, China saying that they want to join CPTPP was really a slap in the face for the Biden administration.
And speaking of the AUKUS agreement, Professor Hall, the Quad meeting actually came after Canberra, London and Washington announced a new trilateral security alliance, the AUKUS, which is aimed at strengthening their strategic presence in the Indo-Pacific. What is the purpose of keeping AUKUS and the Quad separate, one being a military alliance and the other one being a non-military and a rather loosely defined concept?
So the initial purpose of AUKUS is to try and provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. But it's also the case that I think we'll see a lot more defence technological cooperation between those three countries in a whole range of areas. And it won't just be submarines, it will also be in cyber issues, it'll be in missiles and a whole range of other things like that. And of course, the reason why these three countries can do this and cooperate so closely on such sensitive technology is because they're already members of the Five Eyes intelligence network. And in a way, this is a kind of formalization of the core group, the core three of Five Eyes, leaving Canada and New Zealand to one side. It would be much more difficult to share this kind of technology with India or with Japan. And it's not at all clear either that India or Japan would want to develop, say, nuclear submarine technology with the United States or the UK or Australia. So it makes sense, I think, to keep these things slightly separate. And as Professor Kim is rightly saying, the Quad has moved very clearly in a direction of handling some non-traditional security issues and infrastructure, COVID, a whole range of other things like that, partly in order to reassure the region. So we can keep these two separate structures separate in this way.
Professor Hall, now AUKUS is going to allow Australia to deploy nuclear-powered submarines in the Indo-Pacific region. Why are submarines so important anyway? And do you think this will trigger an arms race in the region as some fear?
So Australia's got a particular issue because of its distance away from Northeast Asia, where most of its major security challenges may emerge from. It needs to have submarines that can cover very long distances. And this has been a strategic issue for a long period of time. Now, nuclear submarines, because they can deploy and they can stay submerged for a much longer period of time, would have been the ideal solution 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But Australia chose not to go down that line, partly because of domestic opposition and partly because also the technology would be very difficult to develop and very expensive. So this is a strategic shift, but one which most strategists have thought was kind of logical for some period of time. I'm not sure that it's going to lead to an arms race. These submarines will not be in the water until probably the late 2030s at the absolute earliest. And we need to bear in mind that there will only be 8 of these submarines compared to the 57 submarines that China already has in the water right now around its coastline. So we're only really talking about a relatively small contribution to the broader burden-sharing effort of the US and Japan and other countries in the region.
Right, so the three parties to AUKUS have their understanding, but Professor Kim, what does the new AUKUS alliance tell us or other countries in the region? Is this going to be an Asian NATO?
I doubt it. AUKUS, as Professor Hall mentioned, is a security pact. However, we can't really call it an alliance because if it is an alliance, alliance really is a war community. If it is an alliance, there is a formal agreement saying that if one member of the alliance gets attacked, the rest will come to the rescue. And this is the essence of NATO. You know, that's how the NATO operates in principle. From that perspective, AUKUS, I don't think is going to evolve into Asian NATO, because AUKUS is a defense cooperation pact between these three countries, as Professor Hall mentioned, on high-tech military technologies. What AUKUS tells us is that these three countries are really serious about, countering China's growing military presence in the Indo-Pacific region. Nuclear power submarines, as Professor Hall mentioned, carries overwhelming advantage, compared to diesel-powered submarines. They can stay submerged much longer. They can maneuver in very stealthy manner. Sure, it'll take about 10 to 20 years for Australians to develop nuclear submarines, but these submarines can really travel from Australia to South China Sea without refueling, which is going to be a game changer to the nature of naval competition that is taking place in the region.
And your thoughts on this, Professor Hall? Do you think this might be the next NATO for Asia? And why has it been formed as a triple alliance or a triple party pact rather than including the likes of the French, who already have a military presence in the region?
So that kind of gets into some of the nitty-gritty, difficult details of the various relationships between the parties. I think in the end, Australia was looking to the UK for nuclear submarine technology, but because that technology is shared with the United States, it has to be a tripartite deal. The reality is that the level of trust and cooperation with the French outside of NATO, and particularly between France and Australia, is just not at the same level as we would see with the UK, or especially with the United States. And so logically, if Australia wanted to go and acquire nuclear submarines, going to the United States, going to the United Kingdom was a much more straightforward proposition than doing so with the French, notwithstanding the fact that we do need to have a strong relationship with France, which is an Indo-Pacific power. It has territories in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific, and it makes a significant contribution in this region to security, both traditional and non-traditional.
Professor Kim, the US has it's recently been endorsing their integrated deterrence strategy, the integrated deterrence approach to security. Well, what does this really entail, and why has it made this policy shift?
Well, integrated deterrence is a new military terminology or military jargon, if you will, and the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is talking about integrated deterrence quite often these days. I think it simply means that the U.S. is going to utilize all sorts of strategic assets to deter the adversaries, not just the military assets, but all kinds of assets or power they can muster. It also means whole of government approach to deterrence. And this new approach is necessary because the adversaries are pressing the U.S. for advantages in multiple domains. Therefore, it's imperative for the U.S. to use a different approach. The approach calls for integration of all sorts of strategic assets, as I said, and this new approach also calls for a deeper integration with American allies. Australians and South Koreans and Japanese and other partner countries as well. I think this change is important because of growing tension and rivalry between the U.S. and China, and also Russia, and because of North Korea's growing nuclear capabilities. And it's quite possible for the adversaries to overestimate their capabilities and underestimate or miscalculate American capabilities and commitments. With this integrated approach to deterrence, I think Americans think that they can strengthen their deterrence and make it more credible. And it's very important for the U.S. to be able to deter adversaries before they go offensive.
Professor Kim, what would the implications be from these developments for South Korea?
Well, for one thing, the new U.S. approach to deterrence, this integrated deterrence requires a deeper integration with the allies. That way, American deterrence can be more credible. I think South Korea will have to play a more proactive role in this integrated deterrence posture of the United States in order for the ROC-U.S. alliance to be more relevant and valid. I think South Korea will have to play a more creative and proactive role here. Quad is not a formal alliance, and Quad countries are, they have no intention to make it a formal alliance. But that said, Quad is expanding. Quad is not trying to recruit new member countries. Rather, Quad is seeking new partnerships with other countries in many different issue areas, from vaccine to climate change, to infrastructure building and whatnot, really. And I think it's very important for South Korea to cooperate with these Quad initiatives. To South Korea, Quad is not a matter of whether we'll have to participate or become a member. Rather, I think it's a matter of how we will cooperate with Quad countries on which issue areas. In that respect, I think South Korea will have to be more creative and proactive and open-minded.
I see. Well, due to time, we're going to have to end the interview here, but that was Ian Hall, Professor of International Relations at Griffith University, and Jae-chun Kim, Professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Sogang University. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.